Welcome to Military Analytics. There are some regions in the world that have not lost their importance throughout history. The Baltic Sea and the surrounding region is one of them. The Baltic Sea is the scene of important struggles today, as it was in the past. The tension of the war between Russia and Ukraine is deeply felt in the Baltics. Russia's aggressive behavior in the Baltic Sea triggers NATO and Scandinavian countries, in particular NATO. Baltic and Scandinavian countries are taking a hard line against Russia and maximizing military measures with Russia's aggressive attitudes and NATO's critical steps. The water of the Baltic is getting very hot in international airspace over the Baltic Sea. The aggressive behavior of the Russians is not approved by many countries. However, one Russian violation is stopped regularly, even almost daily. The activities of Russian jets and spy planes over the Baltic Sea were blocked by the Royal Air Force the other day. Russian intelligence planes are deployed to absorb enemy communications and signals for analysis by the Kremlin. Royal Air Force Typhoons took off from Amari Air Base in Estonia to visually identify the large number of Russian aircraft flying over the Baltic Sea. Royal Air Force Typhoons intercepted Russian warplanes flying close to NATO airspace. Typhoon warplanes deployed at NATO's Baltic Air Policing Mission intercepted an An-72 Kohler and two Su-27 flanker Bs. Russian aircraft remained in international airspace. According to the Royal Air Force, Russian planes flew safely and temporarily. Typhoons returned to Amari Air Base to continue NATO's air policing mission. Russian planes frequently tried to violate the airspace over the Baltic Sea. This violation of the Russians is prevented by NATO planes. Earlier this month, the Russian Tu-142 Kulums patrol aircraft flew off the Scottish coast. The Russian Tu-142 approached from the northeast and flew in international airspace over the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean to intercept the Russian plane. The Royal Air Force sent jets from Lossiemouth. Norwegian 35A warplanes were also launched to monitor the Russian threat with the joint efforts of RAF Typhoons and 35A warplanes. The Russian maritime patrol aircraft was intercepted from entering UK airspace in the last days of April. Russian jets and spy planes flew over the Baltic Sea. The UK and German air forces teamed up to intercept Russian warplanes and intelligence planes over the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea. Eurofighter Typhoons from the Royal Air Force's 9th Squadron and the German Air Force's 71 Richthofen were dispatched to intercept the aircraft. RAF and German Air Force pilots are working together to protect NATO's eastern border in a joint operation as part of Operation Azotus. The UK and German Air Forces used Eurofighter Typhoon fighter jets as a combined force from Amari Air Base in the Baltic state of Estonia. It was determined that one of the planes was the Russian Air Force Il-20K, an intelligence aircraft which passed from mainland Russia to the Kaliningrad settlements on the Polish border. The RAF reported that Kute was accompanied by two Russian Su-27 flanker B fighter jets, also based in Kaliningrad. In March, British and German warplanes intercepted Russian planes twice near Estonian airspace. The Royal Air Force reported in March that two Typhoon jets intercepted a Russian military Tu-134 passenger plane known to NATO as Krusty, accompanied by two Sukhoi Su-27 flanker fighter jets and an Ant-12 Cub military transport aircraft. The Royal Air Force described the operation as reassurance that the United Kingdom, Germany, and other NATO countries stood by their Estonian allies at this time of tension. In early April, Germany handed over NATO's Baltic Airspace Security Mission to the UK and continued its support until the end of April. In early May, the transfer of German aircraft to Germany began. In addition, Portugal is currently the leading country in NATO's Baltic air policing. In just 1 month, two Portuguese F-16 fighter jets operating at the border of NATO's airspace in the Baltic intercepted 20 Russian aircraft violating air traffic rules, according to the Portuguese Air Force. These interventions included transport aircraft warplanes and intelligence-gathering aircraft. The Portuguese Air Force took over policing the Baltic airspace on April 1 as the lead country of the mission known as the Baltic Air Policing. Portugal involved 85 soldiers and 4 F-16s and will operate from Šiauliai Air Base in Lithuania for the next 3 months. Portugal's interception of 20 Russian jets in a month reveals that at least one Russian violation per day is halted, giving NATO's interception of Russian warplanes in its airspace. So how do NATO weapons in the Baltic submerge Russian ambitions? The Ukrainian war has led to a rethinking of defenses in what used to be a geostrategic recession. The war created another existential shock in the Baltic. This shock mobilized the West. Defense budgets inflated like a balloon in the region. Poland continues its plan to double the strength of its army to 300,000 soldiers. NATO allies deployed additional troops, armor fighter jets, and advanced air defense systems on the Baltic coast. The United States Air Force has deployed its fifth-generation 22 Raptor fighter jets to Amari Air Base in Estonia. The 12 Raptor was first deployed to Poland's Powidz Air Base in April 2023. These belong to the 94th Campaign Fighter Squadron based at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. The redeployment of the fifth-generation fighter aircraft is carried out within the framework of NATO's Allied Air Command's Air Shield mission to deter aggression in the Baltic Sea region. The operation was described as an Agile Combat Recruitment Deployment. The Agile Combat Recruitment Doctrine means that pilots and technicians can quickly disperse across the country if their home bases are compromised. Such deployments train aircrew to operate with minimal infrastructure. Scattered operations allow an air force to complicate enemy targeting in wartime by duplicating the location of operations and using civilian airfields or improvised road bases. With the looming turn of high-intensity warfare and possibly observing the situation in Ukraine, the Western armed forces have taken a renewed interest in the Cold War-era concept. In early May 2023, United States Air Force Special Operations Command made history by successfully landing an MQ-9 Reaper drone on a highway for the first time during Agile Car exercise. NATO weapons consolidated its dominance over the Baltic Sea. These weapons prevented Russian warplanes and jets from operating in and around the Baltic. President Vladimir Putin's Baltic ambitions were undermined. Finally, with Finland joining NATO, the alliance's forces will be able to more easily monitor and control the critical sea lines of the Baltic Sea. The Baltic states, as well as Bornholm and Gotland in the central Baltic Sea, are becoming increasingly important from a strategic point of view for Russia's access to the Kaliningrad enclave. Gotland will facilitate NATO's potential control of the Baltic Sea region, while Kaliningrad will become a burden for Russia, a country whose fleet does not have free access to its bases. And sea lions cannot be a naval power. Under the Maritime Convention Act of the International Maritime Organization, a subsidiary of the United Nations, Russia has the legitimate right to use vital maritime communication lines in the Baltic Sea to its territory. But this can change dramatically in the event of an armed conflict. In addition to Finland's accession to NATO, other developments and constellations in the Baltic Sea region may precipitate tensions between NATO states and Russia. Western sanctions on Russia restrict the transit of goods to Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg. The continuing and increasing military support of the West to Ukraine is also coordinated and supported through the Baltic states. The U.S. is deploying more weapons systems in the region and expanding bilateral cooperation with Norway, among others. In the future, the U.S. Air Force will be able to use the airfields at Riga and Solonier, Oslo, as well as Stavanger to monitor ships approaching the Baltic Sea. In summary, these measures make the shift of an existing conflict to another geographical area seem like a realistic scenario. It's only a matter of time before the war between Russia and Ukraine foams up in the Baltic Sea. However, the USA and other NATO allies are working to eliminate this possibility with all their strength. With its strategic location, Crimea has been at the forefront of the historical scene for centuries. The importance of Crimea gained a completely different dimension with the Ukraine war. The future of Crimea is a worrying issue. Putin's redline Zelensky's fictitious historic peninsula holds the key to ending the Ukraine war. The Kyiv leader's dream of Crimea gains a more concrete appearance with offensive operations. Explosions have been heard in Crimea almost every day since August 2022. Russian officials on the peninsula are explaining that they shot down a Ukrainian drone after almost every explosion sound was heard. The last of these explosions took place yesterday. Let's take a look at the details of the massive explosions. Explosions occurred in the town of Zonkva in the north of the Crimean Peninsula. Russian officials claim that their air defense systems were working. Oleg Krychkov, advisor to the president of Crimea, Sergei Aksionov, reported on social media that there were no casualties or injuries as a result of the explosions. It remains unclear what caused the explosions. However, considering the attacks across Crimea, the cause of the explosions may be Ukrainian drones. In addition, local people wrote on social media that vehicles are not allowed to exit the Kerch Strait Bridge. After the attack on the peninsula, traffic on the Crimean Bridge was stopped for an hour. The Ministry of Transport of Crimea announced that the traffic was stopped for technical reasons. Russian military expert Boris Rogozin does not specify the exact reason why the traffic on the bridge was stopped. However, there were speculations that the Ukrainian military may have attempted to attack the bridge as well by diverting the Russian air defense systems. The deployment of the Grom-2 operational tactical missile systems to the Crimea by the Ukrainian armed forces fuels these speculations. On the other hand, the waters in Crimea never calm down. Explosions have literally taken the historical peninsula captive. An explosion occurred in the strategic port city of Sevastopol last week. The sky darkened as a Russian fuel tank burned during the day after the Ukrainian drone attack. The reported kamikaze drone attacks set several fuel storage tanks on fire at a large fuel terminal at the western end of Sevastopol. The complex in Kazanka Bay formed a rising cloud of black smoke before it burned, leaving behind charred tanks and pipelines. A large number of firefighters were dispatched to the fire. The facility may not be the primary fuel depot for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. A separate reinforced fuel tank with piers closer to the fleet's main berthing areas in the Sevastopol port probably serves this purpose. Videos from the drone used to investigate the damage at the facility shows multiple fuel tanks being completely destroyed and serious thermal damage to some tanks that did not burn. The damage looks substantial and likely jeopardizes near-future refueling, but satellite images show that the facility is closer to other Russian BSF infrastructure. Telltale overlays show an air defense and anti-ship missile zone to the northeast just across Komisova Bay from the fuel terminal in the analyzed satellite images of April 25. The coatings of the site appeared empty except for a possible vehicle. If this vehicle is related to air defense, it will be a short-range point defense system. A sizable maneuver and vehicle training area is located to the south, and military bases reportedly along adjacent Kazanka Bay are garrisoning BSF S-800 and 10th Guards, Marine Corps Brigade. The brigade took part in the siege of Mariupol and its Azovstal complex and has suffered heavy losses since the start of the war. Whatever the potential impact on operations, no Russian supply officer would want so much fuel and infrastructure to evaporate. The problem is not the fuel lost, but the loss of the ability to conserve large amounts of fuel in the future. Knowing that the installed fuel facilities would be destroyed, Ukraine brought a large fleet of fuel trucks, so the Ukrainians distributed their fuel to thousands of mobile fuel trucks. Any damage to critical supply stocks such as fuel and ammunition could pose real threats to Russian defense plans. As concerns over an impending Ukrainian counteroffensive increase, the fuel tank attack would fit the real Ukrainian strategy prior to such an attack. Russia remains on the defensive as Ukraine prepares for counterattacks. A web of trenches shows that Russia is afraid of losing Crimea. Moscow prepared to elaborate defenses in Crimea, with Ukrainian leaders promising to reclaim all of their rights. Russian-occupied territory. After weeks of digging, the area around the small town of Medvedevo, near the crossing to mainland Ukraine, was covered with an elaborate system of trenches stretching for several miles. Gates are cut at an angle to the ground to give soldiers a greater range of fire. There are other fortifications nearby, including deep trenches designed to trap tanks and heavy vehicles. Satellite images provided by Maxar, a commercial space technology company, show that Russia has installed dozens of similar defense systems. Russian military analyst Ian Matveyev said that it seems that the Russian military understands that Crimea must be defended in the near future. Defenses quickly increased before an anticipated spring offensive by Ukraine, although analysts say an amphibious attack is unlikely. Russia has built miles of fortifications near Vitino, a town in the west coast of Crimea, in just a few weeks. A Soviet-era trencher, the BDM-3 digs as fast as half a mile per hour, even when the ground is frozen. BDM-3 trenching machine has a rotor with buckets at the back. The rotor is lowered behind the vehicle to dig trenches. The rotor drains the soil near the trench, creating front and rear guardrails that are approximately 1.5 ft long and provide additional protection. In addition, the geography of the region presents great challenges for both Ukraine and Russia. Crimea is connected to mainland Ukraine by a narrow, swampy land passage that could stop an attack, but its proximity to the front could be dangerous for an invasion of Russia. This proximity could isolate Russia's forces and put them within easy reach of Ukrainian weapons. While Russia has built defenses elsewhere, the scale in Crimea is striking. Ian Matveyev said, "For Putin, the Crimea is just a sacred cow. If anything happens, soldiers will be sent to this line of defense immediately." On the other hand, Mykola Belyakov, a research assistant at the National Institute of Strategic Studies of Ukraine, said that the size of the fortifications is the best indicator of Russia's fears. But some Western officials worry that a direct fight over Crimea could lead to a dangerous escalation. Top Russian officials, including former President Dmitry Medvedev, have hinted that Moscow will use nuclear weapons to defend Crimea. In another development, according to U.S. Army engineer Steve Danner, it will take considerable time, effort, and equipment to break through Crimea's northern fortifications head-on. Michael Kaufman, a military analyst in Virginia, said it was unlikely that Ukraine would take over Crimea in the classical sense. However, Kaufman noted that Kiev could pursue a depletion strategy by establishing fire control over access to Crimea. Ukraine is already testing this strategy. More than 70 suspected attacks by Ukrainian forces or collaborator have targeted Russian positions in or near Crimea since August, according to data from the Armed Conflict Location and Incident Data Project. Most were airstrikes, including attacks by drones. Some attacks seem to be the work of saboteurs. Although Russia stopped some attacks, most of them were successful. Successful attacks inflicted serious damage on Russia. As a result, all roads in the Ukrainian war will lead to the Black Sea Peninsula. Russian forces in Crimea have been heavily hit by Ukrainian military operations. With long-range missiles supplied from the United States, the Ukrainian army is not only conducting operations against Russian forces on Ukrainian territory, but also against points on the Crimean Peninsula, where important ammunition depots and headquarters of Russian forces are located. Russian citizens who think that Vladimir Putin is unable to provide security in Crimea have started to leave Crimea. In the regions liberated from the Russian occupation, Ukrainian state leader Volodymyr Zelensky is organizing speeches. Zelensky, who states in every speech that Crimea will soon be under Ukrainian rule, adds that the occupying Russian forces will be cleared from Crimea. Speaking in the parliament recently, Zelensky stated that they will start taking new steps in the Crimean Peninsula, where Russia has been in control for a long time, and that the Ukrainian army will organize large-scale operations in the Crimean Peninsula. Zelensky's remarks received a standing ovation from the Ukrainian parliament. 3 weeks after Zelensky made these remarks, the Ukrainian army began operations to retake the Crimean Peninsula. More than 100,000 Russian citizens have left the Crimean territory as a result of the operations launched by the Ukrainian army. In recent months, the Ukrainian army has carried out airstrikes against the city of Mariupol. The Ukrainian intelligence service detected that ammunition and military equipment from the Crimean Peninsula were being transported to Mariupol, and action was taken to destroy the ammunition depot in Mariupol. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry and the U.S. intelligence service worked together to locate the Russian ammunition depot in the port of Mariupol. The U.S. intelligence service transmitted the satellite images it obtained to Ukrainian officials. The Ukrainian army, which took action on this, launched an operation to destroy the Russian ammunition depot in the port of Mariupol. The Ukrainian army in the city of Dnipro fired 4 HIMARS missiles at the ammunition depot in Mariupol, while the HIMARS missiles that reached Mariupol within minutes were expected to destroy the Russian ammunition depot. The measures taken by Vladimir Putin were encountered. Putin, who predicted that the Ukrainian army would launch an air attack here, placed the S-400 and Pantsir 1 air defense system in the port of Mariupol. These Russian air defense systems intercepted the HIMARS missiles sent by the Ukrainian army. Since this operation failed, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry wanted to destroy the main source in Crimea. As it is known, the vast majority of military equipment and ammunition for Russian troops on the territory of Ukraine is shipped from Crimea. The location of the main Russian ammunition depot in Simferopol, Crimea, was determined as a result of joint work between Ukraine and the United States. The American Intelligence Service, which obtained the coordinates of the ammunition depot, shared them with the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army then began preparations for an operation to destroy the main ammunition depot in order to ensure that this attack did not fail, like the attack in Mariupol. Intelligence support was provided from Ukrainian resistance fighters in the region, and it was determined that there was no air defense system protecting the ammunition depot. The Ukrainian army then launched an airstrike on the Russian ammunition depot, again using long-range HIMARS missiles. The HIMARS missiles traveled at high altitudes and managed to enter Crimean airspace. Within seconds, they hit the Russian ammunition depot in the city of Simferopol and caused a huge explosion. The Russian population in the region was shocked by the impact of the explosion with the sound of the sirens in the streets of Crimea. The Russian population began to run towards the shelters in great confusion. The largest ammunition depot of the Russian army was destroyed in a successful operation organized by the Ukrainian army. With this attack, the Ukrainian army not only destroyed the Russian ammunition depot, but also ensured that nearly 100,000 Russian citizens left Crimea. The Russian people who had lost their trust in Vladimir Putin due to the recent explosions and fires on the Crimean Peninsula completely lost their trust in Putin with the effect of the latest incident. The Russian people have begun to think that Vladimir Putin is unable to ensure the security of Crimea. So they are leaving Crimea. Citizens living in Crimea are trying to enter the Russian borders in droves. People have formed kilometers of vehicle queues with the Kerch Bridge completely blocked. It has become completely impossible to get out of Crimea. Russian citizens then turned to the ports and tried to leave Crimea by sea. However, the number of Russian citizens trying to leave Crimea was too large and it was impossible to find a place on the ships. Vladimir Putin, panicked by the departure of Russian citizens living in Crimea, decided to increase security measures in Crimea. Fearing that the Ukrainian army would increase the number of air operations, Putin decided to send 5 S-400 air defense systems to Crimea in order to prevent them. Putin, who also sent 2 Pantsir air defense systems, placed the Pantsir air defense systems around the Kerch Bridge. The Kerch Bridge, which was previously blown up by sabotage, is the only land connection between Russia and Crimea. With the explosion of the Kerch Bridge, the delivery of ammunition and equipment to Russia's troops on Ukrainian territory cannot be carried out. When Putin realized that the Ukrainian army was increasing its air operations, he began to think that the next attack would be on the Kerch Bridge. So he sent the Pantsir air defense systems to the Kerch Bridge and deployed the S-400 air defense systems near ammunition depots and headquarters instead of city centers. Vladimir Putin's move was aimed at protecting his own ammunition and military equipment instead of the Russian people. Since the Ukrainian army has long-range missiles, it has started to carry out operations inside Russia's borders. Vladimir Putin has therefore deployed air defense systems in many cities, especially Moscow. The Ukrainian army has not yet carried out airstrikes against Moscow, but it has carried out airstrikes on natural gas pipelines in areas very close to Moscow. The Ukrainian army has been successful in this regard, carrying out operations to prevent Russia's largest source of income energy exports. In recent months, the Ukrainian army destroyed a natural gas pipeline used by Russia for energy deliveries to Europe. The Ukrainian army is not the only cause of fear for Vladimir Putin. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has forcibly resettled the population of the occupied areas of Ukrainian territory into Russian borders. He forcibly issued Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens, and many Ukrainian citizens have become Russian citizens. Ukrainian citizens who have started living in Russia are reacting to this situation. They do not accept this and continue to struggle. Ukrainian citizens who have formed organizations among themselves, like the resistance organizations operating in Ukraine, have started sabotage attempts to harm the Russian army within Russian borders. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin has deployed troops to protect the natural gas pipelines to Europe. Although Putin has threatened to cut off the flow of natural gas to Europe, no one is aware that Putin is not willing to take such a risk. The Russian army, which is at war, needs the revenue from these energy exports to finance itself. Vladimir Putin would not be able to finance the Russian army if energy supplies to Europe were cut official. Expert researchers say that for this reason, Vladimir Putin is dependent on selling energy to Europe and will not take such a risk. Putin often tries to intimidate Europe by taking the gas pipelines to Europe into maintenance, but it doesn't take long before the gas pipelines are back in operation. The ongoing economic crisis in Russia has started to put the citizens of the country in a lot of trouble. It has become very difficult for local citizens in the country to meet even their daily needs. Putin's investment in the military industry has increased considerably with the failure of every operation in the invasion of Ukrainian territory. Putin, who wants to replace the power lost after failed operations, continues to invest all income in the military industry without considering any economic problems. The people of Russia who think that this is the reason for many problems in the country started to organize anti-Putin and anti-war protests, saying that they could not stand it anymore. However, Putin states that none of these problems can be experienced and argues that these discourses are just propaganda. What will happen next? Let's wait and see. Thanks for watching us.